This talk was recorded for St. Anthony Messenger Press. The speaker is Father Richard Sweeney.
I would like to welcome you back for the second of our sessions on spirituality and the stages of adulthood. I'd like to just kind of review very briefly what we talked about in the last session. You may recall that in many respects, the central point we started with in our last session was the notion that holiness happens or occurs in our life simply when we deal forthrightly, courageously, and directly with the inescapable events of life. And if we deal with those as courageously as we can, as forthrightly as we can, then the likelihood is that the result of that will yield holiness in our lives. It was with that in mind that I advanced this notion of the spiritual tasks that pertain to different phases of the life cycle. And by spiritual tasks, you may recall that I meant to describe certain behavioral tasks or things that we must do as we move through various phases of the life cycle. We said that those spiritual tasks are brought about by some change. Something changes in me and or in my environment. And because of that change, there is now a new response called forth from me. And if I recognize the change that is demanded of me, the response that is called forth, and I provide that response, the result will be growth in holiness, or what we called last week, growth in freedom, responsible freedom, wisdom, and love, which are three of the classic signs of ever fuller life in the Holy Spirit. Now, having said that, last week we looked a little bit at those tasks of the early adult transition, most of which have something to do with becoming one's own person, establishing a sense of identity. And now tonight I'd like to move to the second phase of the adult life cycle that we're considering, namely the phase of early adulthood. And I would like to situate this phase of early adulthood roughly in the years 22 through 38. Now, there's obviously nothing absolute about those years, so they're somewhat arbitrary, somewhat relative, but I'm going to speak of the years of early adulthood as roughly comprising 22 through 38. And I would like to suggest tonight that if there is one overarching theme that stands over the spiritual tasks of these years, it is the theme of getting established. So in other words, I believe that the 5 spiritual tasks that we're going to look at tonight all have something to do with getting established in one's life structure. Now, let me begin by suggesting what I think is a major and the first spiritual task of the adult period. And I might begin by saying this is a task that most of the researchers suggest is especially true of men. It's the task that for one reason or another seems to occupy the energy especially of men. Now, I think some of this is changing today with women entering the workforce much earlier. But the first spiritual task I would like to consider tonight is the task of establishing one's work, occupation, or career. So, a first spiritual task that invariably we will be wrestling with, dealing with, struggling with perhaps, in the early adult period of our lives is to establish one's work, one's career, and one's occupation, which I believe is intensely spiritual and yet oftentimes is not seen that way. Because what we're dealing with is really that place where we will spend the vast majority of the prime time in our lives. We're dealing with the way in which we will spend at least 40 hours of the prime time of our week. And so I believe it's a major spiritual task. Will we be able to establish for ourselves a career, an occupation, a life's work, where we will be able to make a contribution to the well-being of people? In many ways, that's the task that must be performed. I would just like to suggest that I think there's a lot of data that would imply that this task is not easily or quickly performed. For example, I was reading not too long ago a report that was done by the U.S. Bureau on Labor Statistics in 1983. And they studied people in various kinds of occupations in the year 1983 and found that only 1 out of 6 people had been in their present employments or workplace for 15 years. Only 1 out of 6. which is to say that on the average then, in a 50-year work life, the average person would change jobs at least 3 times, if not many more times than that, which I think might seem to suggest to us that this task of establishing one's career, one's occupation, one's life work is not all that quickly done. Now, what more precisely might it mean to establish one's work or one's career? Well, I would like to say that it really requires 2 things. First of all, it means that I have to find or discover that work that matches my talents and my interests. Now, that may seem obvious, and yet it's the very thing that oftentimes is not done. I have to find that kind of work that matches my talents, that does match, to use a more spiritual term, my charisms or my gifts, the things that in fact I can do. And obviously, if I fix upon a particular work that does not match my talents or my abilities, what invariably will happen is I proceed on through that particular life's work, I'll find within myself a growing sense of low self-esteem or a growing sense of dissatisfaction. I am unable to do well in the life's work that I have chosen. So I have to find a particular life work that matches my particular gifts, matches my talents, but it also has to match my interests. It has to be a life work, a career, or an occupation that I'm interested in. Now, I think it's rather interesting that in his study of the lives of adult men that Daniel Levinson undertook, he found that what often happened to many men is that they moved into particular kinds of occupations or careers and did rather successfully and may have done rather well financially, but discovered later on that they really were not interested in the work that they had given themselves to. And so after so many years in that particular line of work, there was a growing dissatisfaction, a growing lack of a sense of meaning. And they had to do the task over again. So in order to establish myself in a kind of work or a career or an occupation, I do have to discover the one that will match both my interests and also my talents or abilities. So I believe that's the first aspect of accomplishing this task. And the second dimension of this, which I think is also often overlooked, is I need to fix upon a particular kind of work that will enable me to feel I am making a contribution to others. So it's important to me to feel that this work that I'm doing, this occupation that I've given myself to, is one that leads me to feel that I'm making a contribution to the well-being of others. In other words, I'm not just making money, I'm not just earning a living, but what I do is of value to others. It improves the quality of life for others. And where that particular dimension of the task is not performed, invariably what happens is that after so many years, there's a growing sense of meaninglessness that begins to penetrate one's work life. So I need to fix upon a particular kind of work or occupation that in fact gives me a sense that what I'm about improves the quality of life for others. Then I'm accomplishing this particular spiritual task. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a task that many of the researchers would say seems to be central in the lives of men during these 20s and also the early 30s. It seems to be the task that occupies most of their energy and most of their attention. That may be changing now with more women entering the workforce. But I would like to share with you some of the research that was done by a woman named Wendy Ann Stewart. She did a good bit of research on adult development in the lives of women. Unfortunately, it's not been published yet, although it is summarized in that small book I referred to last week, Seasons by Anita Spencer. And in the research that she did, she came to this particular conclusion. This first spiritual task seems to be much more challenging for women in our society today, because in many respects, women are called upon to perform this task twice. For example, it may be that the first occupation they fix upon is the occupation of home building. And that may be where the major amount of their energy for 10, 15, or 20 years goes. And then as the children have grown up and begin to move out on their own, women are faced with the challenge of then moving into the workforce and doing that 15 or 20 years behind many other persons, which makes the challenge doubly difficult for women, demands even more of women. Wendy Ann Stewart also goes on to say, of course, there's another approach. And increasingly, women today are really establishing themselves in two careers at once. They establish themselves as homemakers, as home builders, but they're also establishing themselves in their own personal career in the workforce. And that means that in many respects, they're doing the task twice, which is doubly challenging. And one of Wendy Ann Stewart's conclusions is this seems to work well only in marriages where the husband clearly recognizes that he shares the task of homemaking and home building. Only then does it seem to work for both partners to be about establishing themselves in both ways. So I think her research does add new information to the challenge of this particular difficulty when people are really establishing themselves in two kinds of work or two occupations. So that's the first task, and I believe it's a spiritual task because it has to do with exactly what kind of a contribution I will be making to the world around me to establish myself in my work or occupation. Now the second spiritual task of these years is one that I suspect would come rather quickly to mind, and that is not to establish ourselves in our work or occupation, but it is to establish love relationship or intimate relationship. Again, some of the research suggests that this particular task seems to be regarded more highly by women. In other words, they give much more natural attention to this task and usually seem to perform it a little bit better than men. Now that's a generalization, and I'm sure there's exceptions to that, but the research seems to imply that that is the case. But in these years of the 20s and the early 30s, one of the things we're called upon to do is to establish a capacity for intimate relationship. Now, you may recall, last week we talked about the fact that one of the signs of the Spirit, or life in the Spirit, is love. You recall, I think we said then that one of the things St. John of the Cross, the great Spanish mystic, says is at the end of our lives, God will evaluate us in one thing, and that is, how well did you love? How good did you become at loving? And that is a spiritual task that befalls us, especially in the second phase of the adult life cycle. Now, what do we mean by intimacy? Well, let me say clearly that by intimacy I don't mean necessarily a physical, sexual intimacy, although that certainly may be a part of it, and hopefully there will be genuine intimacy expressed through that. But I don't mean solely physical or sexual intimacy. I'd like to use the word intimacy very much in the way that Erik Erikson uses it. And Erikson maintains that intimacy is this. It's the ability to commit oneself to particular relationships. The ability to commit oneself to particular relationships and to develop the strength that I need to stay with those, even when they call for sacrifice and compromise. So it's this ability to commit myself to particular relationships and to develop whatever strength I need to stay with those relationships when they call for sacrifice and compromise. That's intimacy. Whenever I think of this definition of committing oneself to particular relationships, I think of the fairly famous Charlie Brown Peanuts cartoon, a two-frame cartoon, one of the more famous ones that Charles Schulz did. And the two frames are this. You have one frame in which Charlie Brown is saying very calmly, I love mankind. And then in the second frame he says, it's just people I can't get along with. Well, intimacy, as we're describing it tonight, has something to do with committing oneself to particular relationships. And I would like to suggest that intimacy really requires us of at least three different characteristics. First of all, in order to commit oneself to particular relationships, I need to have a capacity for personal disclosure and mutuality. A capacity for personal disclosure and mutuality. In other words, I need to be reasonably comfortable disclosing something of myself to this other person, revealing to the other person much of what transpires within me. So I need to have a capacity for personal disclosure. But I also need to have a capacity for mutuality, which is to say, I'm the kind of person that invites this other person to disclose themselves to me. I have that ability. Now, I don't know if it's your experience, but it certainly is mine, that oftentimes we do encounter people who you may never have met before in your life, and as soon as they meet you, within about 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, they've kind of told you their whole life story. There's a lot of personal disclosure that goes on there, but not a lot of mutuality. Somehow they don't invite me to disclose my story to them. Now that's not real intimacy. Intimacy requires both my ability to disclose myself and the ability mutually to invite the other person to do the same. That's a requirement of intimacy. Now, there's a second requirement I'd also like to mention, and that is empathy. Empathy, which is the ability quite literally to feel with another person. To feel with another person. In other words, I can step over into the world of another person and begin to feel what I think he or she is feeling. If I can do that, then I have a capacity for intimacy. Now let me just say here parenthetically, you may recall last week that we said that if I don't negotiate a particular spiritual task in one phase of one's adult life, I'm very likely going to have difficulty negotiating later ones. And one of the things I think we might see at this point tonight is that if I do not have within myself an established sense of identity, it would be very difficult for me to have empathy with another person. It's very difficult for me to step over into the world of another person and feel what they're feeling, because I will be afraid that I will lose myself. So if I do not have a reasonably established working identity as we defined it last week, I will be reluctant to enter into intimate relationship because I'll have a fear that I will lose myself. And I will be reluctant to personally disclose myself because my assumption is the other person will not like what they see. So intimacy requires a functional sense of identity. Now, the last quality or characteristic I think is necessary to have this capacity for intimate relationship is what we called last week a supple sense of oneself. And by a supple sense of oneself, I mean the willingness and the interest to learn more about myself from this other person. So I assume that if I enter into an intimate relationship, it's going to change me. I will discover, find out, see aspects of myself that I've never quite seen before in the same way. And if I have a supple sense of myself, then I'm interested in the kind of new information that will be given to me. I seek it out, and I'm open to it. Therefore, the definition of intimacy that we're putting forth here tonight says that a person has a capacity for sacrifice and compromise. I think it's important to say something about the word compromise, because there's a bias in our American society that compromise is a sign of weakness. It's a sign of losing. It's a sign of giving in. In reality, I believe compromise is very much the opposite. Compromise is oftentimes a sign of strength. It means that I have a strong enough sense of myself that I don't need to win in this situation. I don't need to dominate the situation. I am comfortable enough with myself that I can compromise. And if I have that capacity, then very likely I have a capacity for intimacy, for sacrifice and compromise. Now, we might raise the question, how do you know whether a person has an intimate relationship or whether a particular relationship exhibits the kind of intimacy we're talking about? Or how do you know how deep the level of intimacy is? Well, I believe that one rather simple way of at least gauging that, however imperfectly, is to ask the question, what actually gets shared between these two people? What actually gets shared? And I think we could almost arrange, almost in a kind of hierarchy, the kinds of things we share. And the level of our sharing with another person will pretty much indicate to us the level of intimacy. For example, I believe it's rather easy, not extremely difficult, to share at the level of opinions and ideas. So without too much difficulty, we can talk about what our opinions are, about the weather, about politics perhaps, about sports, whatever it might be. As long as we're on the level of thinking, ideas, and opinion, the intimacy level has not become too challenging yet. If we move below that to the level of feelings, then there's much more intimacy occurring. So if I begin to share with you what I'm feeling, which I may or may not quite understand, I'm sharing with you a deeper part of myself, a less conscious part of myself. I'm showing you more deeply who I am, and that requires more intimacy. I believe we can move even a little bit more deeply than that, and we can share with one another at a level of disagreements. And if I begin to talk with you about the very areas I know we will disagree about, then that requires more intimacy, because it requires me to be able to trust that you won't reject me even if you don't agree with what I say. So if we can talk very honestly about the areas that we disagree with, that's a sign of intimacy. It's an area that's of great personal concern for me, because on our faculty at the seminary where I teach, we've been talking about the level of intimacy among the faculty. And it's interesting to me that we still, as a faculty, have a great deal of difficulty, so it seems to me, in sharing our disagreements, our different perspectives. And I believe that says something to us about how intimate we really are with one another. So our ability to share disagreements is definitely a sign of intimacy. I'd like to say, though, there's even a deeper level than that. And that is when I can share my doubts, my questions, and my fears with another person, then that's a deeper level of intimacy yet. When I can share the very things that somewhat terrify me, my doubts, my questions, my insecurities, then I'm revealing to you a much more deeply vulnerable part of myself. And I would like to say, lastly, in my mind, one of the deepest indications of true intimacy is the ability to share with another person what I think are the negative aspects of myself, what I think are the most reprehensible parts of myself, the most unappealing, negative, bad, if you will, parts of myself. What Carl Jung, the psychologist, calls the shadow, the part of myself I would just like to discard, get rid of, throw away, never bring into the light of day. If I have an ability to share that with you, then that's a sign of tremendous trust and I think tremendous intimacy. So if we want to know how intimate are we able to be with a spouse, friend, work associate, or whomever, I think to ask that question, how much am I able to share with them and that person with me, will give us some kind of an insight. Why is this a spiritual issue? Because I think that we know what most transforms people is the capacity to honestly share oneself with others. That has transforming power to it. So if we're interested in fostering the mutual growth of one another, which is how we defined love last week, then developing this capacity for intimacy is crucial to that. So I believe this is a central spiritual task of this second phase of the adult life cycle. Now, let me just conclude this section by saying Sigmund Freud was once asked by a devotee of his thought how he would define the mature person. And he was expecting a rather elaborate, full-blown, extensive definition. And what Freud said to him was this: Leben und Arbeiten, two German words which means to love and to work. A mature person has a capacity both to love and to work, which corresponds to the two spiritual tasks we've named thus far tonight. Let me move then to the third of the spiritual tasks I'd like to consider. And I must say this is the one task that I find the least bit written about and the least amount discussed thus far. But that is the task of establishing a personal faith. And I would put an accent on the word personal, to establish a personal faith. In other words, I believe that one of the central spiritual tasks of the early adult period is to come to the realization that it does not suffice for me to live my life with the faith of my parents or my peers or even my religious authorities in my life. The only kind of faith that will enable me to deal with the challenges of life is a personal faith. And that is to say that the spiritual task I must undertake in this area is to begin to choose what beliefs and what values I will live my faith by. I will live life by. So what will be the values and what will be the beliefs that I build my life upon?